All right, good morning, everybody. It's time for us to go ahead and get started in our Bible class today. So if you'll grab your Bibles and open up to Hebrews chapter 7, we'll be looking at a few verses from there in just a few moments. That's Hebrews chapter 7. Today is class 13 of our study through the Epistle to the Hebrews, and this marks two significant occasions for us. First of all, this is the halfway point. So for the entire semester, which spans these two quarters, next quarter is slightly shorter than this one. And so today marks us being halfway through our study of Hebrews. To some of you, that's great news. We're halfway done. To others, it might be bad news. We're only halfway done. So you could view it as that glass full, glass half empty situation. But either way, we're halfway through our study. Second, we're now starting into chapters 8 through 10, which form a new subsection of the greater topic that we've been working through in Hebrews. Near the end of chapter 4, we transitioned from talking about Jesus as revelation and Jesus as Lord into Jesus as the Christian high priest. These last three chapters are the end of that larger topic of Jesus as the Christian high priest. With that said, they are the most important chapters about Jesus as high priest. I'm going to call them somewhat casually the heart of Hebrews. And it's not that the first 7 chapters have all just been preparation for these last 3, but these last 3 are where the author really provides his best exegesis, argumentation, and his highest Christology that we've seen so far. Now, before we get into that new material, let's briefly review where we've been. In Hebrews chapter 7, particularly that second half of the chapter, the author lays the groundwork for the next 3 chapters by emphatically showing that God always intended for Christ to serve as the Christian high priest. And there's a specific promise of God that shows that he always intended for his son to be high priest. Where does that promise from? Psalm 110:4, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. So God speaks long after the establishment of the Aaronic priesthood through David the psalmist to promise to someday provide an entirely different kind of priesthood. Jesus, as a legitimate high priest of God, must be part of that Melchizedekan order. Why does the author say that Jesus must be part of Melchizedek's order rather than Aaron's order? Because legally, Jesus would not be allowed to participate in the Levitical priesthood. Thus, we know that God has changed the priesthood. He has made a change in high priest, and that also changes a few other things at the same time. In chapter 7, verse 12, what was the first thing that we saw changed with the priesthoods? A changing of a priesthood necessitates a changing of the law. What about in verse 22? What was the second thing that changed? A change of the priesthood also necessitates a change in covenant. In verse 25, we had one more. Because we have a new intercessor in that verse, we now have a new salvation. I'm going to phrase it as new salvation. Maybe it should just be explained as a more extensive salvation in some way. The author links these various features of our relationship with God, so that's the law, the covenant, and our salvation, with the priesthood. We explain this as a priestly bundle. You have a priesthood which both represents and is intrinsically connected to all of these other facets in the same bundle. When you change priesthoods from priesthood A to priesthood B, you must also change everything in the bundle. So a new priesthood also means you have a new law, a new covenant, and a new salvation. Similarly, if a priesthood is superior to another one, all of the items in its bundle are also superior to the other. So if you see in priesthood B that it has a superior salvation, then you know that priesthood is more superior than priesthood A. The point is that God always had the intention to someday change the priesthood, to provide his covenant people with something better. The author spends a lot of time laboring on this point, showing that God always intended to change the priesthood because this would have been jarring This would have been a difficult thing for many early Jewish Christians in the first century to understand and accept. We know that a lot of early Christian Jews had been looking forward to the Messiah during their Jewish religious life, but that still doesn't necessarily make the replacement of the old but beloved any easier. By showing the beauty and the intentionality of God's providence all throughout the Old Testament, the author has shown that God always intended to give his people an ultimate prophet, priest, and king. In last week's class, we looked at some of those Old Testament prophecies and foreshadowings, as well as some of Jesus' actions as high priest, both during the Gospels and in the rest of the New Testament. Christ's priesthood was always part of God's plan and is, in fact, the best thing that could have happened to us. And the author expresses this at the end of chapter 7 with some slightly different phrasing. So let's read a few verses from the end of chapter 7 to set us up for our new material today. In verse 26, "For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens." Jump with me to verse 28. "For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priest, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever." It is exactly fitting that we have a high priest like Jesus, that we have a high priest who is perfect forever. Now, as high and mighty as the language at the end of chapter 7 sounds, chapter 8 starts with something even better. It's the main point of the entire book of Hebrews. So let's read that together, starting in verse 1. "Now, the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man." So at the end of chapter 7, we just read where the author said, wouldn't it be great if we had a high priest who was holy, who was innocent, who was unstained, and an exalted priest? Guess what? Good news. That's exactly the kind of priest that we have. That's exactly the kind of priest that God has seen fitting to provide to his covenant people. And the way the author expresses this at the start of verse 1 always catches me off guard. Now, the point in what we are saying is this: it's rare in Scripture that we ever read an author tell us, here's the main point of my message, or here's the main point of my epistle. So before we go any further, let's pause for a second and say, why is this the main point? Let's try and answer that question. Why would he emphasize this as the main point of his epistle? What's the epistle to the Hebrews meant to accomplish? Maybe we can start there. It's meant to accomplish endurance in those who read it. We understand them to have been persecuted in some way or facing upcoming persecution. So the applicational goal is endurance. How does this main point help with that? Yes. Having Christ as our high priest means that we can handle life's challenges, life's persecutions and problems with a divine helper. Now that we are in the midst of persecutions, or we see it coming on the horizon and coming to us soon in life, it's important to know that when we are discouraged, considering giving up, we need to know who we've got on our side. We have exactly the fitting kind of priest that we need, one who is holy, unstained, interceding for us. We've got the Son who is seated at the right hand of the Father. And having the Son on your side comes with some amazing benefits. Now, one of those benefits we've already talked about extensively, and that's the intercession of the Son. He prays for you. He gives you help from heaven. That has appeared a few times through Hebrews already. It's going to appear a few more times as we go forward. But chapters 8 through 10, as we move into this heart of Hebrews, we're going to see that there are several other benefits which we receive as sheep under the care of our high priest and shepherd. So that's what we're going to be covering in chapters 8 through 10. But before we get there, we need to briefly talk about the method that the author uses to tell us about the benefits of having Christ as our priest. Now, you might have seen this in the handout already for this week's class, or it's even in the schedule from all the way back at the start of the semester. The next 3 chapters of Hebrews are altogether one large, what I'm going to call a symphony. And it's a symphony that is broken out into 3 progressive movements. Movement 1 is what we'll cover today. That's the whole of chapter 8. We're going to call this the New Promised. Chapter 9 begins movement number 2, which only goes until verse 22, so most of chapter 9, where we see the new foreshadowed. And then in 9:23 through nearly the end of chapter 10, we move into the new explained. And these really do behave like 3 movements of a symphony. So some of the motifs that are introduced early on, or that we've already seen in the book of Hebrews, are going to be played on repeat throughout these 3 movements. Each one will add its own unique emphasis, and each one will expand where maybe others have given us very little information, but we're going to see a lot of the same themes pop up over and over. In particular, there are 3 sub-themes which all of these movements use. Each movement begins by discussing God's sanctuary. It then moves on to talk about the sacrifices that are performed within that sanctuary, and then ends by discussing the covenant that results from those sacrifices. We're going to see this sanctuary, sacrifice, covenant movement happen in all 3 of these movements. All right, so we have 3 sub-themes, 3 movements, 1 large symphony that repeats all of these over and over. So I'll briefly summarize the difference between these, and then we'll get into movement 1. The first one primarily focuses on God's sanctuary and his covenant. Sacrifice, you're going to see today, is barely mentioned. Both of these topics, really all 3, are discussed by using God's own spoken word from the Old Testament. We see where God has revealed something to the ancient Israelites, and that's interpreted as a promise for God to one day provide a new sanctuary, sacrifice, and covenant for his people. The second movement in chapter 9 slightly diminishes the emphasis on sanctuary, barely mentions covenant, but the section on sacrifice is massively expanded. And that expansion is done by showing how the Old Testament rituals and offerings foreshadowed the new ones that God would bring about in his new covenant. They could not accomplish God's goals, but they could foreshadow its future fulfillment. And lastly, the third movement brings all 3 subtopics, sanctuary, sacrifice, and covenant, in near equal amounts, but it uses the sharpest and most emphatic language of the whole epistle. And this is where the author is really concluding his arguments about Christ's priesthood. We started it back in chapter 4, is going to end in chapter 10. He concludes this long discussion on Christ's priesthood, provides the most powerful and the fullest explanation about what it means to have Christ as the Christian high priest. So let's go ahead and get started now and begin with this first movement, talking about the new sanctuary that God has promised. We'll begin by rereading the description of the sanctuary in those first 2 verses. So again, in verse 1. Now the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. This has popped up already a lot through Hebrews, but where is Jesus serving as high priest? It's in heaven. You'll remember all the way back in chapter 1, we had repeated emphasis about how the Son is seated at the right hand of the Father. In chapter 4, we read that Jesus had passed through the heavens in order to intercede for us. In chapter 7, we just read Jesus is exalted above the heavens. And my point is simply, we've read a lot about Jesus and his relationship with heaven. This whole epistle has been full of Jesus in heaven. But we haven't yet stopped to talk about the importance of this fact. So let's begin with that discussion by noting, how is heaven described in these two verses? What do you learn about heaven from this one sentence? Let's start in verse 1. What do you learn about heaven from verse 1? So there's a throne, that's right. We have some kind of seated dwelling place of the Lord that is in heaven. That's going to be important later. What about in verse 2? Sorry? So Christ is ministering there. That is Christ being a priest. And how is the place described with Christ's ministry? God set it up as coming last. That's the last end of that verse. Before that. Sanctuary. Mine says minister in the holy places is where Christ is serving as the priest. Both of those work, either sanctuary or holy places. It should remind you of other things that you've read about in Scripture. What else? After being a minister in the holy places? In the true tent, or in the real tent, and this is where we finally get that tent has been set up by the Lord and not by man. There's going to be two major points that I want us to bring out from these four descriptions that should really help us understand a bit more about how we should view heaven and Christ's work in heaven over the next 3 chapters. The first one is maybe a bit simple, but I don't want us to miss it, so we're going to make sure to emphasize it. Over and over again throughout chapters 8 to 10, the author is going to compare the Old Testament sanctuary with the new heavenly sanctuary. Most directly, it is the tabernacle of Moses rather than the later temples, which is the focus of the author's comparison. And like I said, this might seem simple or might be something that we've already heard several times and we assume is just an underlying condition within Hebrews, but I don't want this slipping past us or becoming confusing at some later point. Whenever we read something about the tabernacle or the earthly sanctuary, it's intended to teach us something about the heavenly sanctuary. They are meant to be compared and connected. Similarly, whenever we read something about the heavenly holy places, it's supposed to remind us of the earthly, of other things we've already read in Scripture. And that's why the author refers to the heavenly place of Christ's ministry as a holy place, just like the interior of the Mosaic tabernacle. That's why it has a seated dwelling place, just like the mercy seat did inside of the tabernacle. And that is why it's also described as a tent. These two sanctuaries are meant to have a paired relationship where we can compare them with one another. And this brings me to another addition that we have to make in our minds. Sanctuary is now included within the priestly bundles. When you have priests, and when they change, you have to change the law, you have to change the covenant, you have to change, what was the last one? The salvation. Now you also have to remember, you have to change sanctuaries. A change in priesthood results in a change in sanctuary, and a superior priesthood requires a superior sanctuary. And this leads us to the second important fact that we learn from these first 2 verses. Not everything is similar between these two sanctuaries, the earthly and the heavenly. They're also extremely different. That is most emphatically portrayed to us in the description of the heavenly sanctuary as the true sanctuary. I'd encourage you to read the word true there, not as a measure of honesty, but rather a measure of reality. So we could maybe rephrase this sentence to say the heavenly sanctuary is the real sanctuary. And if the heavenly sanctuary is real or true, and that's the one set up by Lord and not man, what does that imply about the earthly sanctuary, which was set up by man? Okay, it's temporary. I would say if the heavenly sanctuary is the true one, the real one, that means the earthly one is less than real. Type and antitype is going to pop up all over this. And yes, I'm trying to describe that same concept in maybe some slightly different words. The author is portraying the earthly sanctuary as perhaps being less than real, the heavenly sanctuary. All right, that is the contrast that's being set up here. This shouldn't be entirely unfamiliar to us, as I don't suspect that it was entirely unfamiliar to the author or the original audience. What do we typically call a worldview or a philosophy that says that the spiritual things are more real than the earthly things? It's not Gnosticism. It's Platonism, or Platonic thought. That will have later led to some of the controversies that we see perhaps with Gnosticism in like the 2nd and 3rd century AD, but Platonic thought came far before that. It was Plato or his teacher Socrates who popularized the concept that there is a realm beyond physical existence, a realm of thought that is more real than the physical realm. Now, across the millennia, Platonic thought has interacted both with Jewish theology and Christian theology, sometimes for terrible purposes, and sometimes for very great purposes, as Platonic thought contains a lot of helpful truths for Christians. Most relevant to us here in Hebrews is that Scripture confirms the existence of a realm that is more true, is more real than the realm that we call reality. And it's within that truer realm, that realer realm, that Christ ministers as priest. As we move into the next set of verses, our understanding of this truer, realer realm is going to develop a bit further as the author introduces the second subtopic of this first movement. So let's go ahead and read about sacrifice and sanctuary together in the next 3 verses. Starting Hebrews 8, verse 3. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." The author starts verse 3 with a factual basis. What is that factual basis? High priests have to do something. What is that? High priests must make offerings. That's part of the reason why they were appointed to their position in the first place. Therefore, if Christ is high priest of a heavenly sanctuary, his offerings must also be a heavenly offering. So here's another item that we're going to now shove into the priestly bundle. If you change priests, you must change sanctuaries. You must also change offerings. And the quality or the efficacy of this offering is intrinsically connected to the quality and efficacy of its priest. So let's back up now and briefly consider the quality and efficacy of the Levitical high priest offerings and their sanctuary. How did the Old Testament priest get the whole ritual system? How did they learn about their offerings and sacrifices? Well, the high priest had to learn it from someone as well. It was, what? It was explained as the law, that's right. It's part of God's revelation to the nation. So it's at Mount Sinai when the law was delivered, the priests were appointed, and sacrifices were prescribed at that point. Also at the same time, the sanctuary was described and instructed for the people. And you may have noticed this, but throughout Hebrews so far, for each of these revelations at Mount Sinai that we just listed, we've also already studied the mediums by which these revelations were made. How did God reveal the old law? It was through the angels, and back in chapter 1 as well, through the prophets. And both of those are inferior to the revelation which is God the Son. How did God appoint the Old Testament priests? Back in chapter 7. How did he appoint the Old Testament priest? Jesus is appointed by an oath, and they were appointed by a command. They received no oath. So the command, the executive command that appointed the Old Testament priest is inferior to the sworn oath of the Son. So how did God instruct Israel to make sacrifices or to build their tabernacle? How did that revelation occur? Moses was given a pattern, a blueprint, a set of instructions which was inferior to the heavenly rituals and the heavenly tabernacle. All of these forms of revelation show the inferiority of the old in contrast with the new. So let's quickly turn back now to Exodus chapter 24. Let's take a look at how God revealed this blueprint to Moses and to Israel. Back in Exodus chapter 24. Setting the stage for Exodus 24, back in chapter 20, the Exodus generation has just reached Mount Sinai after preparing themselves for a visit from God. They had to consecrate themselves for a series of days. Then the Lord descends on the mountain with thunder, shaking, smoke, and fire, and he speaks the Ten Commandments directly to the people. And that terrified them. That, of course, had them shaken. And so they beg Moses to instead be their mediator. Don't let God speak to us anymore. You speak to God, and then bring God's messages to us. So then Moses makes a trip up the mountain by himself. He receives a kind of abbreviated version of the law that just had civic laws, some animal laws, Sabbath laws, and then a short description of the covenant that God intended to make with his people. In Exodus 24, Moses brings that shortened law and that description of the covenant back down to the people. He tells it all to them, relays the message, and the people respond, "All that the Lord has said, we will do." But the nation has not yet received all that the Lord will say. They've agreed to obey some of his laws. They've agreed to enter into a covenant with him, but they don't even know how to worship God yet. They haven't been told anything about how they are actually supposed to interact with or worship their new covenantal Lord. So to communicate this further information, God invites Moses back up the mountain. Only this time he brings with him Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they all see the Lord. They see the Lord in his heavenly sanctuary. Then all of them except Moses go back down the mountain, and Moses alone receives a kind of special extended vision of the Lord in his sanctuary. So all the way at the end of Exodus 24, let's start reading in verse 18. Moses entered the cloud, went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel that they take for me a contribution. From every man whose heart moves him, you shall receive the contribution for me. This is the contribution you shall receive: gold, silver, bronze, blue and purple scarlet yarns, fine twined linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, goat skins, acacia wood, oil for the lamps, spice for the anointing oil, and for the fragrant incense, onyx stones and stones for setting, for the ephod and for the breastpiece. And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst. Exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and of all of its furniture, so you shall make it." The 7 chapters of Exodus record what Moses saw during his 40-day tour of the heavenly sanctuary. God's goal in this extended vision to Moses is to give the people of Israel a copy of his heavenly home. God is showing the Israelites how to make a place for him to dwell. And he didn't just do this by describing what would hypothetically be a good place for God to dwell. He made this revelation by showing Moses that a heavenly dwelling place truly existed outside of the physical realm. There is a realm, there is a sanctuary that is more real than the physical sanctuary on earth could ever be. Any earthly sanctuary, tent or later temple, was only a replica, a copy of that true Platonic ideal which exists outside of this realm. This revelation to Moses has some huge implications for both the Jews and for us as modern Christians. The first implication I'm going to phrase as a rhetorical question. Why would God show Moses a heavenly sanctuary if he intended to always just dwell in an earthly sanctuary? The implied answer is he wouldn't. This is just like the author's prior usage of Psalm 95. God referenced there that there was a future promise for his people. They hadn't achieved their rest yet. Therefore, everybody should know the rest still remains ahead of us. He also used Psalm 110 the same way. They already had a priesthood, and yet God refers to another one. So everyone should know God intends for a better priesthood someday. Now they receive the earthly sanctuary, but in Exodus 25, God references a heavenly sanctuary. We're supposed to read this as a promise of God to provide a better tabernacle than what the Israelites ever had at Mount Sinai. God intends to give his people a superior law, a superior sanctuary, and a superior high priest. And that's not all. The second major implication of this passage is that it's not just the sanctuary. In Hebrews, what else did the author group into this revelation that Moses received at Sinai? Does anybody remember? We can turn back to Hebrews chapter 8 now. Sorry? Not the covenant. We're getting there hopefully soon. It's the sacrifices. The sacrifices are also part of this extended revelation. In Exodus 28 and 29, it's part of that 7-chapter-long description of the new tabernacle that we first hear about the Levitical priest. We've never seen them before. In those chapters, Moses describes their clothes, what they look like. He describes their ordination, how they become priests, and then he describes the offerings that they're going to make. So the rituals that they will perform as priests. Back in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, the author writes it's even the service of these Old Testament priests that were part of the mimicry of the heavenly things. All the sacrifices of the Aaronic priesthood were modeled after the offering that occurs in the true sanctuary, in the heavenly sanctuary. Third major implication that we should get from this revealing of a heavenly sanctuary might not seem immediately obvious to us if we've grown up with a worldview that was very different from the original recipients, or maybe it seems overly obvious to us. But the heavenly things are implicitly better than the earthly things. So far, we've mostly just been calling it truer or realer. But we should also understand the superior quality of the heavenly things over the earthly. And this is made most clear in the next few verses. We're quickly running out of time, so let's press on now into verses 6 through 13. Starting in verse 6. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law into their minds. I will write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities. I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. This extended passage adds a lot to our priestly bundle. What all is Christ's priesthood or Christ's ministry attached to in these verses, particularly in the opening 4 verses? First is covenant, that's right. We saw covenant already back in chapter 7, but now it's really coming into the spotlight. What else is put into the priestly bundle? Covenant is intrinsically attached to something else. But before that, there's something else that's attached to the covenant. The promises, that's right. The covenant is better because it's enacted on better promises. I have one more thing that's in these first 4 verses that's included in this priestly bundle. Covenants in there, promises are in there. What else? Ministry is going to be Christ's priesthood itself, so I'm going to call those the same. Not the sacrifices. What is covenant attached to in verses 7 and 8? Sorry? A mediator, still priesthood there. There's something else. In verse 7, for if the first covenant had been faultless, there would be no occasion to look for a second. Verse 8, for he finds fault with them when he says, behold, the days are coming when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel. Who is them?
In this context, I believe would mean that he's establishing not just for the Jewish nation, but for all people.
It's people, that's right, okay? What we have included with the new covenant and with the old covenant is people. That means that we can put this into the priestly bundle as well. The author says that a faultful covenant leads to a faultful people. A faultless covenant must lead to a faultless people. Again, they rise and fall together. They change when you go from one priesthood to another. You change the covenant, you must change the promises. It means you also change the people. Now, we've covered how the Old Testament promises make a better sanctuary, better sacrifice. Let's try and quickly look at this promise of a better covenant. We don't have time for the rest of this, so we're really going to rush through this. I'd like us to take a closer look at Jeremiah 31, but we're just going to have to summarize a few things here. This is the longest quotation that we receive of the Old Testament in all of the New Testament. The author has the longest continuous quotation from the Old Testament here. And this comes from Jeremiah 31 in verses 31 through 34. The section of Jeremiah that this quotation comes from is after the fall of Judah to the Babylonian Empire, after the people have been taken as slaves or captives and redistributed across the empire to either repopulate or to work. And God writes this letter through Jeremiah to send to the captives, and then writes another book after that, recording his future restoration, his plans for this people, that he will someday restore the nation of Israel and will restore his covenant with mankind. As we've already seen in Hebrews, this new covenant that God promises is not just about homeland or rest or political liberty. It is full of better, new promises. So let's quickly try and walk through these better promises as we close up class today. What is the first new promise that we read about from the quotation in Jeremiah 31? The new covenant is built on better promises. What's the first better promise that's then established after that? He will put his law within and upon the hearts and minds of his people. What does this imply about the Old Covenant? I would say it implies that it could not put God's law within or upon the heart. This is why we see the connection between the quality of the covenant and the quality of the people who are part of that covenant. It didn't transform their hearts. Now, what does it mean to have God's law on your heart? Or within your heart? I would define this idiom as having God's word in your heart is having heartfelt obedience. Okay, so you are aligned, you are walking with the Lord. You now know his laws, not just superficially, but they are something that actually go through your entire life. There's another contemporary of Jeremiah who made a very similar prophecy. Does anyone have a guess about who I'm thinking of? It's Ezekiel. That's right. Ezekiel 36. I'll read this for you because we don't have time to turn. Starting in verse 26, the Lord prophesies for the future restoration of his people. I will give you a new heart, a new spirit I will put within you. I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh, give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you, cause you to walk in my statutes. Be careful to obey my rules. Then you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and then you shall be my people, and I will be your God. It's a part of God's new covenant that he promises a heart that was unobtainable under the old. Under the new covenant, we can now walk in his statutes, and we can obey his rules. Let's briefly talk about the application of this and the impact that it would have had on the original audience. Remember, they were persecuted. They were struggling. Their faith was being tried, and they don't know if they can remain faithful. We've read several times that they appear to be considering apostasy. With the Christian high priest and with the Christian covenant, they now have something that the ancient Israelites never had. Christians have a regenerated heart which can obey, and it can walk in God's laws even when the old heart would have failed. So that's the first promise. What's the second promise that we see God makes in his new covenant, or he builds his new covenant upon? What I'm looking for in verse 34 is they will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me. Again, what does this imply about the old covenant? I don't think it has to do with their being born into the covenant, no. I would say it implies that the old covenant could not accomplish the truer, realer knowledge of God that will be attained under this new covenant. That isn't to say that the old law, the old revelations of God were somehow false or disingenuous, but they were not the full revelation. They were not the complete revelation of God to his people. How do Christians know the Lord in a way that's more real than the Old Testament Israelites? How do we know God better than them? It doesn't have to do with the moment of our teaching, no. How do we know the Lord better? Back to chapter 1. In these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son. He is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. Christians know God in a complete way because we have received Jesus. Therefore, we no longer need either platitudes that are man-made, analogies, all sorts of things trying to teach us about godly perseverance or God's compassion. We can go straight to the source. If you want to learn about godly perseverance, look at Jesus. If you want to learn about God's compassion for suffering mankind, look at Jesus. We have the exact imprint of God. We can see him in a way that was never seen by the Old Testament Israelites. We now can know the Lord. And finally, that third promise that comes at the end of the quotation from Jeremiah is, I will forgive their iniquities, and their sins I will remember no more. This promise is going to end up being one of the stickiest ones for us in the upcoming classes. What does this imply about the Old Covenant? it implies that the old covenant could not accomplish the real forgiveness of human sins. And this should immediately make us pause and ask, didn't God specifically state his forgiveness of sins several times throughout the Old Testament? In fact, look at the other promises up here. Doesn't God also express that several Old Testament individuals walked in his commandments, or that people knew him at various times throughout the Old Testament? This week, as we continue to meditate on this and get ready for the next movements in this symphony, we should consider whether or not these promises of the new covenant are actually exclusive to the new covenant, or if all of these things could in fact be accomplished without the priesthood, sanctuary, sacrifice, and covenant of Christ. So as we proceed into chapters 9 and 10, we will return to these promises. We're going to see how Christ fulfills them in a very unique way, how he accomplishes God's goals uniquely. And we're also going to see how these promises are demonstrated in our lives, how Christ accomplishes these things for you and me. In closing, handouts for next week's class are in the back. They're on the 2 tables out there in the foyer. Please make sure to grab one of those on your way out. Take a look at the new material that we'll be covering next week. Thank you all for your attention.